I forced my dying mother to pay me $200,000 every time I visit her.
In most ways, I had a pretty typical suburban upbringing. It was me, 31M, my brother, 29M, and my parents, 58F and 61M. We grew up outside Chicago and were huge Michigan fans. Michigan football and the tennis Grand Slams were big in our house. If you wanted my dad's approval, and he was the man of the house, you played either football or tennis. Since both my parents were under 6 feet and not broad-shouldered, that basically meant tennis. I always liked tennis, but didn't love it. I preferred programming in video games. I played enough tennis to get good exercise and make the high school team. But my brother, he loved tennis and got good enough to get a scholarship. My father was so proud. While neither parent treated us poorly, my brother was clearly my father's favorite and I was clearly my mother's, who herself enjoyed video games and we could play for hours. One thing that did set us apart was money. Neither of my parents worked really. They would do odd jobs, mostly at the school or tennis clubs, to keep close to us kids. That's because my maternal grandfather had left my mom and my 2 aunts a trust fund before he died. Not sure what it was when we were kids, but I know right now my mom's has over $12 million in it. My mom has taken some out over the years to buy the house and cars, but mostly they just live off the dividends, which are over 6 figures. The one stipulation is that only blood relatives are ever allowed to touch the trust. So my dad has no claim to it, but if my mom gives us permission, we could have our own. My mom has said she would give each of us our cut of the trust when we turn 30. As you know, I'm past 30 and never received mine. Well, for that story we have to go back to 2019. When I walked in on my fiancé, who I had been in a relationship with since my sophomore year at Michigan, and brother having sex. Apparently, this had been going on for several months and they didn't know how to tell me. While I had a full-time job working for a tech company and also had just finished creating my own video game with a friend, my brother was a pro athlete on the tennis circuit. At the time of their affair, my brother was riding high after winning the Big Ten tennis championship his senior year and making it to the quarterfinals of the French Open his first year as a pro, where I must say he was defeated 6-0, 6-0, 6-0 by Nadal. Apparently, that was enough for my fiancé to throw away an 8-year relationship. Off topic, but god damn it, Fouquet her. The fallout was initially pretty brutal for my brother. My mother lost it, calling him a disgrace and cutting him off. My father was more sympathetic but supported my mother initially. Being cut off killed my brother. He was living off their support to pay for his tennis training. This is important because not 3 months after this initial blow-up, I get invited to a family dinner. Not unusual. But when I show up, it's my father, my father's brother and his wife, my mom and my brother and ex-fiancé. I almost left right then, but my mother asked me to hear them out. My brother apologized for hurting me but told me he was in love and wanted to let me know that never meant to hurt me, but it just happened. My uncle then chimed in about how he and his wife made similar mistakes, but it's still the best thing that ever happened to both of them. My uncle's wife was married with someone else and they started as an affair. My dad said how important the family was and that we needed to stay together. He then looked at my brother and grabbed his shoulder. My brother looked at me triumphantly. He knew he had won. My mother had refused to make eye contact with me the whole time, but I looked at her and after being silent for all the speeches I asked her as she agreed. With a tear falling down her cheek, she nodded yes. At that I said, "Well, I hope you all have a good life, but I won't be a part of it anymore." As I walked out the door, my father yelled that if I left I wouldn't get access to the trust. I looked at my mom and asked if this was true. She started crying but nodded and softly said, "Yes." I looked her directly in the eyes and said, "I'll never forgive this betrayal." She started bawling but no one came after me. I hadn't heard or seen any of them until a month ago. 5 years of no contact. My aunt called and said my mother was in the hospital and desperately wanted to see me. I told her no and hung up. She called back several times in a row, and on the fifth one I finally picked up, and before I could tell her off, she said my mom would wire transfer $100,000 into my account if I would meet with her. I countered at $200,000 and said I didn't want my father or brother there. She confirmed. The next day the bank called and got my info for the wire transfer, and once the $200,000 was in the account, I called my aunt back and confirmed a time and place. I showed up at the hospital to find that my mother had been diagnosed with stage 4 lung cancer. The same shit her dad had. She looked awful. True to her word, my father and brother were not there. We talked for an hour. I told her about my life. I was working on a second video game. My first one had been sold to a distributor, had done good, not great, business, and they offered me a spot to work on a second game. I was doing well enough to own a family-sized condo where I lived with my girlfriend of 3 years who was pregnant with our first child. My mother was overjoyed. She tried to tell me about my father and brother, but I didn't want to hear it. At this point, she broke down and told me letting me leave was the biggest mistake of her life. She cried for several minutes. A couple nurses had to come in and check on what was happening. She got so upset, and it only got worse when I told her that leaving the family was the best thing that I ever did, and I had no intention of ever forgiving her. The shit they put me through and siding with my brother so quickly after he betrayed me wasn't worth $6 million. I went to walk out and she said she would do anything to rebuild the relationship. I told her the best I could do was $200,000 for every visit and no contact with my dad or brother. And I could meet twice a week for an hour, so $400,000 per week. She agreed, and in the past month I've made $1.6 million. I have no interest in forgiving anyone and don't plan on attending her funeral. But I will empty that trust and screw my father and brother. 2 hours in front of someone I hate a week is well worth their suffering. So it's been 9 months since I last posted. My mother died 3 weeks ago, about a month after my daughter was born. My mother was able to meet my daughter. I wanted to charge her $1 million for the privilege, but my girlfriend said no. Fair enough. Many asked what my girlfriend thought of my charges, and while she thought it was a bit cruel, she was also cheated on. We actually met here on Reddit in the Surviving Infidelity sub, and understood my position. She also softened when she realized almost all of it was going into a trust for our children that even I couldn't touch. Don't want what happened to me to happen to my children. Don't even trust myself here. Overall, I visited my mom 53 times and received $10.8 million. Between that and her medical bills, the trust has less than $200,000 in it. She died just in time. She couldn't afford me anymore. True to my word, I did not attend her funeral or the reading of the will. I am upset about that. It appears to have not gone well since I received calls from lawyer threatening to sue me for taking advantage of a dying mother. But I have my ducks in a row. She signed it all away and was in her right mind. Well, right mind-ish. She was still reeling from the consequences of her decisions. My brother's wife is screaming at me, and from the texts I don't think it's even my ex-fiancé, which is hysterical. She must have left him when his tennis career fell apart. He hasn't even made a Grand Slam since before COVID. Love my ass. My dad has tried to find me and called me from a bunch of random numbers and left voicemails. They range from blinding range to pleading. Without that trust, he has nothing. No career, no 401k, no pension. He'll be working until he dies. Probably at McDonald's. That's about his skill level. Actually, that's offensive to food service workers. My dad has never worked that hard a day in his life. He's not even at that skill level.